Let's open up this episode by taking a look at the front brake lines on our 91 Firebird. We're mainly concerned with the long line that travels from the driver's side over to the passenger side. Because of how it's crammed in there between the engine and the crossmember, it's tough to get a look at it, but there are a couple spots that look pretty rusty, so I'd like to replace it. That long line connects to the passenger side brake caliper hose on one end and the combination valve on the other. We'll also remove the driver's side front brake line, but it's much shorter and looks to be in good shape. The first step to removing these lines is just to get to them at all, so we'll start by removing the air cleaner housing. This is probably the 5th time we've removed it in this series, so we won't go into any more detail about it. And once all the components are disconnected, we'll remove that housing along with the intake air hose. The next step is to remove the bolts that hold the little brake line clips to the body of the car. I wasn't really able to get any good footage of this because it's hard enough to see the things, let alone remove them. So you'll just have to imagine the one clip on the driver's side and the 3 clips holding the passenger side brake line to the car. We'll start by removing the shorter driver's side line since it should be easier. First, we need to break loose the flare nut holding the brake line to the combination valve. Using a flare nut wrench, it came loose surprisingly easily. On this particular combination valve, that driver's side brake line connects at the rear at a bit of an angle. Then we can unthread it the rest of the way by hand and try to use a paper towel to catch any drips. By this point, the system was pretty empty, so not much comes out of there, but I'm sure it'll drip sooner or later. And since the brake hose has already been removed, the other end of the line is disconnected and it can be removed from the car. Well, after a few minutes of creative maneuvering. With that out of the way, we tried to unbolt the passenger side one and tried for a while, but weren't able to get it out of the car. It might be possible, but with the engine in there, it's really hard to maneuver it around. It sandwiches right up against the oil pan between that and the front engine crossmember. So this time we'll go ahead and take the easy way out and just cut off the old line. Steel brake line is pretty tough stuff, but bolt cutters will get the job done. In fact, it ended up being so difficult to remove, we cut it twice. And here are all the pieces laid out. This will be our template for the passenger side brake line. Now that we can really take a good look at it, the brake line actually looks fine. In fact, the driver's side one looks almost perfect. Well, rust-wise anyway. So as it turns out, we would have been totally fine leaving that passenger side brake line in the car. But oh well, at least now we can be completely confident in the brake lines. Nowadays, for most vehicles, it's possible to get pre-bent brake lines, which really reduces the amount of work. In this case, we'll be doing the bending ourselves and making the lines from these spools. Bending steel brake lines sucks, and I'll pour one out for you if you have to flare a piece of stainless steel. So this line that we have here is pretty cool. This is NiCopp line. It is nickel and copper, and is much stronger than something like aluminum, although it bends similarly to it. We previously used this to redo all of the brake lines on our '88 S10 Blazer. It's been around 3 years since then, and the lines are still doing perfectly fine. Another benefit of this line over steel is that it's not going to rust. It will tend to oxidize a little bit and get that coppery blue-green kind of color, but at least it won't hurt anything. This line bends and flares like, well, butter, and the downside there is that it feels, well, like butter. The factory uses these rock guard springs, and they can cause issues and lead to rusting out of steel lines, but generally, it's a good idea. And when it comes to really soft line like this nickel copper stuff, I think it's even more important. This particular rock guard came as a set with the brake lines we've ordered. This piece of 3/16 line is actually a leftover from the Blazer, and it's short enough that we'll go ahead and bend the whole thing straight-ish, and then we'll slide the rock guard over it and kind of guess how much we're going to use. We'll also remove the hold down clips from the old brake line so that we're ready to install them on the new one. Since these clips fit over the rock guard, if you weren't reinstalling one, you'd have to space out the line a little bit. And now for the tricky part. We're going to try to match these bends as close as possible. We'll start on the end and on one of the trickier parts, which is the pigtail coil. It's very common to see these coils in brake line. They help absorb some vibration and allow the whole thing to expand and contract a little bit between different points. Without something like this, what could happen over time is the material could work harden and the brake lines could crack. So we'll do our best to replicate what came on the car from the factory. I'm probably the most fond of this particular type of tubing bender, although even this kind isn't the best for doing circles. The trick here is not to make a bend so small that the tube collapses. The tubing bender helped us start the bend, but we'll go all the way around with it using this 33mm socket. This NiCopp line is soft enough that pretty much anything stronger than a toilet paper tube will bend it just fine, but for steel line you'd want to use something a little sturdier. Basically, I'm holding the line flat at one point and pressing it around the perimeter of the socket at another. Having the rock guard on the line while bending it can also help spread out the force a little bit. Anytime you're bending lines or doing anything even remotely similar to this, of course, make sure you have enough material at the ends. You could have the most beautiful bends in the world, but if the tube ends up being half an inch too short, well, you're kinda screwed anyway. In this case, the end was about the same length as the other line, but I wanted it to be a little bit closer, so I bent it around a little farther to make sure there was enough at the end of the line. Also, whenever possible, it's a good idea to leave a little extra material, so just in case the first flare doesn't work out, there's enough room to make a second. I haven't had problems doing any kind of flare on this NiCopp tubing, but with steel, or especially stainless steel, that's a real possibility. Now that everything seems approximately correct and that most important bend is done, we'll go ahead and put the line in the car. In hindsight, it would have been a good idea to flare the end of the brake line before installing it into the car, but I guess I got a little carried away there. I also didn't appreciate the difficulty of moving around the rock guard on the tubing once it was installed, since it's such a tight fit, and it probably would have been a good idea to cut that beforehand. But we'll just keep following along with how things went. It was pretty difficult to feed that brake line between the engine and the cross member, and again, not really possible to film. Well, not practical anyway. Basically, we ended up just bending the brake line to fit, sliding it a bit, bending it again, sliding it again, bending it again. You'll want to avoid bending it more than necessary, and especially bending it back and forth in one spot more than necessary. But after 10 or 15 minutes, the line was most of the way through, and I finally realized that I needed to flare the end of it. We've got a lot of new brake line fittings sitting around, but of course, as it usually goes, not the ones we need. This is the proportioning valve side of the old brake line, and we'll go ahead and pull the rock guard off of it. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what this brake line fitting is. I think it's an M11 by 1.5 metric fitting, but either way, we don't have a new one, so we'll be reusing this one. Luckily, it appears to be in very good shape. We'll also make a note that the line has a European-style ISO bubble flare. The quickest way to get through this tubing is to once again use those bolt cutters. Since those crimp the end, we wouldn't be able to get the nut off of it, so we'll flatten that down a little bit and slide it off. At this point, we've flared lines several times on this channel, but this time we might as well show a close-up of it. This is just a scrap piece of line, since the other one is already on the car because somebody got ahead of himself. And we're using one of the old school, cheap, clamp style flaring kits. We'll start by matching up the size of the tubing with the slot on the tool and slightly tighten it down. Then we'll set the stick out of the tube to match the first shoulder on the die. Then we'll fully tighten the wing nuts evenly. Making a bubble flare is a one-step process. We'll insert the die into the tubing and install the press. A drop of brake fluid between the die and the tubing will help everything press down smoothly. We'll start tightening it down and do our best to ensure it stays straight. With NiCopp line, it's so easy to flare that it's not too difficult to keep it straight, but with steel it can be a bit of a fight. Then once the die has bottomed out against the tool, we'll loosen the press and can remove the tubing from the clamp. Of course, in an actual application you'll need to install the flare nut before flaring the tubing, but you'll always forget the first time, so this is a pretty accurate demonstration. And now that we've shown the process, we'll move back to the piece we're actually using. We'll push back the rock guard enough to have room to work and smooth over the edge of the tubing. We're not looking to remove much material, but we do want a smooth, even surface to start with. The inside edge appears that it already has been deburred, so we'll leave it alone. Then we'll go ahead and install the tool and tighten it down and no, dang it, what did I just say? Then we'll install the flare nut, install the tool, and start tightening it down. We'll get the height of the tubing set just right, tighten it down, and install the die and press. It can be a little bit tricky to do this by hand, but at least with nickel copper tubing, it doesn't take a ton of force. Also, at least we're not upside down pressed against the gas tank or anything, which is a common place to use a tool like this. So once the die bottoms out against the tool, we'll remove the press and unclamp the tubing. The flare is nice and even, the edges are clean, and we even installed the flare nut. It's looking pretty good. So we'll finish bending this side of the line and get it underneath the combo valve where it needs to be. We'll put some anti-seize on the threads of the flare nut and tighten it down into the combination valve. Since this brake line tubing is really soft, I would strongly advise against over-tightening it. Obviously it shouldn't be loose or anything, but that doesn't mean you have to impact it down either. Anyway, now that the line is tightened down, we'll finish adjusting it and get it just where we want it. We'll make those last few bends and then reinstall the brake line clips. And with the center section of the line tucked up where it needs to be and all 3 clips reinstalled, we can move to the other side of it. We've already bent this side to match the bends in the old line, and we'll have to cut it to length. But first we have to shorten the rock guard, and as mentioned before, it would have been a better idea to do this before installing it onto the car. We had to be real careful, but the thing that ended up working to cut the rock guard off was just an abrasive wheel on a Dremel. We had to be real careful because we don't even want to put a scratch in this nickel copper line, but it worked out and we were able to remove the excess length of rock guard. Then we kind of eyeballed the length and again just left it a little bit longer than we think we needed to and used a tubing cutter to cut it off. These cutters that use a disc are pretty effective and can leave a nice even cut. And there we go. We'll go ahead and deburr the inside of the brake line as well as smooth over the outside edge. Then we'll put an ISO bubble flare on the end of it the same way we did on the other end. The flare nut on this side is also metric, but it's a more standard M10 by 1mm. Still, we'll go ahead and reuse the old one since it's in good shape. And with that all together, we'll make our flare and make sure everything looks good. Here's a close-up look at what our flare looks like. It should be concentric and even on all sides with no noticeable burrs. I've found that since NiCopp is so soft, it's pretty forgiving and will kind of reshape itself as you tighten it down, but this is a pretty much ideal flare. At this point, it's a good idea to take some brake clean or something and blow out the line just to make sure there aren't any little specks of metal left in there from when we deburred it. Then we'll put some anti-seize on the threads and connect it to our new brake hose. To make this easier, we've locked the brake hose in place with its hold-down clip. And with that threaded in place, we'll check the fitment of the line and then tighten it down. Again, we don't want to over-tighten this fitting, although we're kinda just going by feel here. And with the line fully seated, we'll insert the middle section of the brake hose through the bracket in the strut, and also reinstall its hold-down clip. And short of reinstalling the caliper, this side is pretty much done. So now we'll take a look at the front driver's side brake line. Of course, this one is much shorter, and it really appears to be in just about perfect shape, so we're not going to replace it. On this channel, we're definitely about making too much work for ourselves, but we have to draw the line somewhere. We'll just go ahead and blast out the line with some brake clean, and make sure the flare surfaces and the threads on the flare nuts are clean. Here's a close-up look at the side that connects to the combination valve. And here's the side that connects to the brake hose. Everything looks really good, so we'll just go ahead and reinstall this line. We'll feed it back through, apply some anti-seize, and reconnect it to the combination valve. Then we'll tighten down that single hold-down clip. And just like on the other side, we'll thread it into the new brake hose, tighten it down, install the hold-down clip, and then get the middle section of the hose clipped into the strut bracket. At this time, when we were looking everything over, we noticed that the connector for the brake pressure switch didn't actually go to anything. Whatever happened, we will be trying to reconnect it. Some vehicles have a fluid level sensor in the master cylinder that will set off the light on the dash if the fluid level gets too low. Instead, this car uses a pressure sensor in the combination valve that detects a significant difference in pressure between the front and the rear lines. Normally, that would indicate that half of the master cylinder fluid reservoir is empty or some other significant brake problem. So you can see why we would want to wire that back up. We'll just be reconnecting the wire using a heat shrink butt connector. These are simple, secure, cheap, and very effective. Once it's crimped in place, we'll shrink down the wrap and put the whole length of wire in a new piece of 1/8" split loom tubing. At some point I'll have to talk about my love for split loom tubing, but for now I'll just say the 1/8" size is underappreciated and a lot of places don't stock it. but it's super useful for these single wire connectors. Anyway, we'll tuck all of the wires back up, tape it up, and reconnect the pressure differential switch. I'm very glad we noticed this, as it's definitely something you would want to know. The light will only come on when the pressure differential switch grounds the wire, which means if it's disconnected, you would just never see anything at all. The pressure differential valve would still close, meaning the front and back would still stay hydraulically separated, but other than the brakes feeling weird, you wouldn't really be notified of it. So at least it's connected again, and it probably works. And with all of that in place, the next thing to do is reinstall the caliper that we rebuilt in the previous episode. Because of the angle the brake hose needs to be at, it ended up being easier to bolt it to the caliper first and then slide the caliper onto the rotor. So we'll install the new bolt and 2 new copper washers onto the brake hose, and then thread it into the caliper. We need to make sure the brake hose is on the right way around, that it's fully seated, and that we're not going to be twisting the brake hose when we reinstall the caliper. Oh, and if there's ever a question as to which brake caliper is the right and which is the left, just remember that the bleeder screw always needs to be on the top in order to bleed out the air. And with the hose connected finger tight, we'll rotate the caliper around and make sure everything seems like it's going to install okay. It's hard to see here, but the rubber protective sleeve on the outside of the hose ended up being a little far forward and was getting pinched against the caliper. We simply used a large flat blade screwdriver to lift it back and made sure everything was tightened down flush. And now that everything's looking good, we'll reinstall the brake pads and then slide the caliper back into place on the rotor. And with that lined up, we'll install the first of the 2 brake caliper pins. From my experience with this kind of pin, it doesn't matter too much what kind of grease you use, as it'll get washed off anyway. But we'll just go ahead and use a light coat of white lithium grease on the sliding surfaces. That would be the ends of the pins that slide inside of the outer rubber bushings, and the outsides of the steel sleeves that are on the inner side of the caliper. And once both slide pins are fully in place, we'll go ahead and tighten them down with a ratchet. Then we'll go in with the torque wrench and tighten down both to 35 foot-pounds. Then we'll torque down that brake hose banjo bolt to 32 foot-pounds. And other than bleeding the brakes, it looks like this side is done. It's always a good idea to check and make sure the brake hose isn't too twisted. You can follow the lines along the hose, or the writing on it in most cases, to verify that there's not too much twist in any one part of the hose. And now that the passenger side looks good, we'll repeat that same process for the driver's side caliper. We'll bolt the hose to the caliper, install the brake pads, install the caliper onto the steering knuckle, grease and install the slide pins, and then torque everything down. And we'll make the same checks we did on the other side to make sure the brake hose isn't twisted and appears to be in the right position. And it looks like that'll about do it for this episode. We'll have to wait until next time to rebuild our master cylinder, fill the system with fluid, and bleed out all the air. But before we completely finish this episode, there are 2 notes we'd like to make about the last episode. First up, we showed a little highlight of the master cylinder and mentioned that the front part of the reservoir goes to the front brakes and the rear goes to the rear. That was wrong. We'll go into more detail about the function of the master cylinder in the next episode, but suffice it to say, this era of plastic jam reservoirs are reversed, while the earlier ones that I was kind of thinking of, like on my 78 Firebird, are not. And the second isn't a correction, but it's something I missed when editing the video and forgot to point out. Instead of explaining this again, let's flash back to episode 6 of our 1978 Firebird series. So the shoes on this side are on the right way around. The shorter shoe, the primary shoe, is in the front. The longer shoe, the secondary shoe, is in the rear. And now we can plainly see the long friction lining shoe versus the short. In this case, the backing is identical, it's just the friction lining that's different. And back to the 91 Firebird, we noticed that somehow the exact same thing has happened. Only this time, it was somebody else that made the mistake of putting them on backwards on one side. We can see that the passenger side of the vehicle is correct with the short shoe in the front, but the driver's side is actually reversed and has the long shoe in the front. Realistically, this isn't the biggest problem in the world, but it could cause uneven braking, so we'll look into fixing this in the future.